Welcome, Mary Tautin Moloney, to the Poetry Channel and to another episode of Talking with Poets. I love these conversations with poets, and I admire and
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
sure and thrilled that you're talking together about the at the base of Kaaterskill or Kaaterskill Falls. This is the book. Um, beautiful image on the cover, and uh, and it's been published by Broadstone Books, and it's available now at Broadstone or elsewhere. So, Mary, um, you know, uh, tell me about how you sort of came to write this particular book, but perhaps you can talk about how you came into poetry first, and when did you
Mhm.
started writing poems, and when did you feel that you had sort of when did you start calling yourself a poet and so on?
Right. I came to poetry a little bit later, I would say, as an adult. I was in my late 20s. I had not been exposed to poetry, sadly, up until that point. I'd written a few poems as a kid, but it was really more in my late 20s that in just journaling and writing in general, I started to write in a poetic form and really connected with it. And I lived in Minneapolis at the time and went to the Loft Literary Center in Minneapolis. Have you been there in
I,
Minnesota?
I've been there a long time ago, but yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. I lived there for about 10 years. So a great place. And I landed in this great community of writers. And after about a year, I just decided I wanted to really dive in more deeply and spend more time. So professionally, I'm an instructional designer. And I quit my job and I moved to New York to get my MFA at Sarah Lawrence College. So that was an amazing experience and really, it was a start of a huge education and I had so much to learn. I had so many poets to read. I hadn't workshopped extensively, so I really was immersed in it, and I'm very grateful to have had that chance to be so deeply in that world. And then from there, I continued to write, but I had my full-time job, and I also got married, and I had a couple of kids. So I continued to write and work on individual poems, and I think as with any collection, I mean, I do know writers sometimes start with an intent or an overarching inspiration. For me, it was just finding time to write and writing individual poems. And then over time, discovering how groupings of poems spoke to each other. And then later, having time to put them together in a collection. So, Indran, it was a really long process for me. It was many, many years to write the book and then many, many years to publish it. So, um, yeah, that's kind of been my journey so far.
Right. And I wouldn't know if it was many years or a brief, intense sort of experience, because the poems are flawless, they flow, and yet they're fractured deliberately. I think, in this sort of lyricism that is, and 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 in the fractures there is truth to be discovered and pulled
Mhm.
out, and teased out. They're not necessarily given spoon fed to the reader or to the listener, but there's such beauty to the sounds of the words said out loud that I think, just like with a painting, you can sort of look at the painting many different angles and contemplate it over time and go back to it. And I think this is the true of these poems.
Thank you. I love that. Hmm.
Tell me about Kaaterskill Falls, at the base of Kaaterskill Falls. Now, tell me about that place and
Hmm.
and how that title came up, and then perhaps you could read a couple of the poems, maybe the first couple of poems in the book, and just so that our listeners can get a sense of what we're talking about. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, yeah. Kaaterskill Falls is in the Catskill Mountains, the Eastern Catskill Mountains. And I started going there when I lived in New York City. I was there about 8 years, and it was just a beautiful place. It's not too far. It's like a couple hours, 2 or 3 hours to get there. And this particular waterfall is a two-tier waterfall. Um, and it's very intimate. And, because you've got the top, which is really hard to get to, and I've never been there. But then there's one landing that's a little hard to get to. And then there's the bottom, which is very hidden. And that's where the poem started, sitting at the bottom and looking into the pool. Um, so that's the place. It's a really striking place. And the title poem is also the first poem, and I think it sets up this idea of being in a physical place, but also, the epigraph of the book is everyone knows they're not where they are. So this idea of also having an interior landscape where a lot is going on. And certainly in this poem, there's a lot going on in that sense.
Yeah, because you mention in one of the poems in Dreamcatcher, live the questions now, Rilke said. And I was thinking that under Kaaterskill Falls, you're living the questions or asking the questions, and these questions come up throughout the book. Um, Tell me, would you like to read a couple of
Sure, yeah.
the first couple, as you wish? But I just thought, you know, the old line about begin at the beginning, then go to the end, then stop, that I learned from Lewis Carroll. So let's begin with at the base of
Let's,
Kaaterskill
yeah,
Falls. All
begin
right.
at the beginning. At the base of Kaaterskill Falls, my bathing suit is loose from accumulations of ocean sand and laundry soap, soft and slack in my hands like an offering. I am a new wife, hidden by the full length of my husband, pulling off my pants in early autumn. The idea to swim began with the light, low sun through still, full trees. It seemed to hold the sudden depth of water without a lot of questions about why now or how long. On the morning of our wedding, rain bounced from a winter sky. I had envisioned the kind of current that carries. Still, the man waited at the altar like a stag stripped from the Song of Songs. In the pictures, I appear transformed, a pearl released and lifted into grades of deeper water. I see him now, crouched near the surface, and there I am on the silent lurch of rock, a breath of a wife. I stand at the edge, unable to separate falling from a choice to fall.
There you have these profound questions, right? And
Yeah.
observations. I stand at the edge, unable to separate falling from a choice to fall. So it's almost, I mean, it's the poem to begin the book, right? Because you're talking about a journey and an experience, and you're talking about falling. I think
Mm,
about whether it's Dante's, going through the different circles, or
mm,
Lewis Carroll falling into, Alice falling into the bottom of the. I mean, you begin with a fall. Milton wrote, of course, Paradise Lost, and there's a fall, and there's a religious Catholic theme or iconography throughout this
mm,
book,
mm.
along with the marriage. Here you talk of the Song of Songs. Tell me about that line, I am a new wife hidden by the full length of my husband. What were you thinking of when I mean, it's a beautiful line, and it's just mysterious too. The full length of my husband, and then the stag, the Song of Songs. So this is an Old Testament love song that your
Mm.
book of love songs that you're referring to,
That's right. Yeah.
and so I'm just these are all things that just come to me, but I'm not asking very specific questions. I just want you to just reflect a little bit more about why this particular imagery entered the poem, or if you can, sort of, I understand it might have been subconscious or unconscious as you were writing it, but now with some distance, can you sort of help us uh, tie the images together?
Yeah,
So,
sure. I mean, I think being in starting a marriage, starting a life with someone else in whatever form, there's this, um, you know, hidden by the full length of my husband, I think there's a sense of um, this joining in a relationship, but there's also the sense of what will happen to me as an individual person, and how how will I be in the world, you know? And I think that's a moment of kind of maybe hiding in the question. I'm not entirely sure, but that was sort of the spirit of that moment, I think. And, you know, the Song of Songs is such a beautiful, it's a very like erotic, beautiful love song. And I think this particular relationship, there's that pull of someone who you find in your life who you feel very grounded in, maybe for the first time. And so I don't know, pulling, I was raised very Catholic, and my mythology is kind of the Bible. Like that's kind of what's in me. And 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 that image of this stag, it's so concrete and it's so strong into my mind that it felt right in this poem.
Yeah. No, I grew up in Catholic too in that sense, and with this imagery, so it's a natural universe for me to
Yeah.
read. But one wonders, each one's mythology is at the same time one's mythology, but also a universal mythology. In other words, I mean, I think every faith tradition, every cultural tradition can see the stag and the song,
Yes. Yeah.
but interesting line about like a stag stripped from, which has a sort
Mhm.
of a kind of violence to that phrase, stripped from, not. So anyway, intriguing. I don't want you to. I'm not. I mean, if you feel like adding some more on that, that's what I mean. Your poems are images, lots of images for contemplation, and I read them that way. So there may be a larger arc, a larger story in this particular poem, but then I can also just take each phrase and just that will be my sort of meditation for the day,
Yeah, nice. No, I love that you pulled out that word stripped, because I think I don't know if you've had that, being in an event like a marriage or a ceremony, religious ceremony, there is this heightened sense of being alive, and approaching someone for something like marriage, you can feel like you do feel very stripped, I think, in that
Right,
moment.
right, right, right.
Yeah.
Um, stripped down, made bare,
Mhm.
revealed, and yet you're in this contract, you're in this sort of partnership, this new partnership, a choice to fall rather than falling.
Right. Yeah.
Also, um, how about before? Would you like to try that as well? Because I think
Yes.
there's a question in there that I think is basic to not only your poetry, but for all of us to contemplate. Go ahead.
Yeah. Before Before breakfast, the ocean unfolds its damage. At the gate, three birds in a bush. And is it two in the fist? Flutter distant, flash of wing. In my body, baby rolling siren songs. My mother saw my shape once, eye tracing cheek. That was all. That was all. The birds pitch their call. What makes us loved? Ocean rocked in its leagues, belly a muscled stone I touch, daughter pressing. What makes us loved?
I was haunted by those lines. That question, of course, what makes us loved, and then the daughter pressing, what makes the sort of the inquiries of the children to the parents. Um, the I think of also in my own reading of Pablo Neruda's Book of Questions, El Libro de Preguntas, and he asks these unanswerable questions,
Mm,
or surreal questions, or sometimes, you know, is there anything sadder than a train motionless in the rain? That's one of the questions, and
Mm.
others. So what makes us loved? Ocean rocked in its league's belly, a muscle stone I touch. You have a short lyrical line, and in this case, couplets throughout 2, 4, 6, 8, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. You have a 14-line poem actually, which is the general form of the sonnet, right?
Mhm.
But I've been teaching a course on what I call the free sonnet, so I've just got 14 in my on my in
Yeah,
my
interesting. Yeah.
uh, and you have a number of sort of internal rhymes, but this is not uh, a formal poem in that sense, but in one sense, but it is a poem where the poet is paying a lot of attention to sound and to appearance and to the beauty of the poem. And I mean, on the page, there's just a visual beauty, an oral beauty,
Thank
and the themes are and an essential question: what makes us love? So, I mean, I don't know what more can one want from a poem than that. I
you.
mean, we can say this about many of these poems. I mean, just one after the other. I, I have my personal favorites, but I would love to hear more about when you were writing this book. When did you become writing this particular book rather than a series of individual poems? And when did you realize that you were making these connections between these poems? I mean, I can say globally that this is a love song. This book is also another song of songs, right? Except
Mm.
it's your song, and at the base of Kaaterskill Falls.
Mhm.
But go ahead.
Right. I think um I think when I started writing the interior landscape poems, it seemed like a missing piece. I wouldn't have said this back when I was putting it together, but that it took on more of a life for me when that was there, when that piece came into play. And those poems, they're kind of threaded throughout, and they are sonnet length. They started in a visual place. My husband took these pictures uh, in the subway stations of New York, where
Mm,
they used to have posters where they would strip the posters to put up new ones.
okay.
And what's left behind is this kind of layered a picture from one poster, a color from another. It's very abstract. And he did extreme close-ups on that. So it was doubly abstract. And I decided to just take those prints and write to them, um, write what I saw. And then as I wrote, it really felt like a journey. It felt like an interior journey. And I really, it brought something together for me with the poems I already had. And then when I had an opportunity I had a fellowship at a really good time when I had all the drafts, and it gave me just 4 weeks time to see them laid out on the ground. And then I felt like a sense that it was coming together.
Very
Pretty
good.
gradual though.
Pretty what? Sorry?
Pretty gradual though.
Gradual. Yeah.
Yeah.
But interior, I love that word interior because there's a book also called The Interior Landscape, Poems from a Classical Tabula Anthology that A.K. Ramanujan translated. And that was the
Mm.
first time that poetry was made available in English in the United States anyway. And it was a seminal book. It changed, it formed lots of poets. And it was one of the books that helped shape me. And it was
Oh.
and so when I am fascinated by the interior landscape, and you have an
Mm.
interior landscape also with the husband as a subject in the poems, and this exchange you just explained about photographs and then writing from images that he has taken. I I I'm, would love to hear a couple of the interior landscape poems that you say run throughout the book. And
Sure.
I'd also like you to think about or talk about influences and lines, specific lines that you've brought into the book from. I mean, I couldn't help but resist note the Whitman line that you
Yes.
you end the book with. I'm a great, like many, great fan of Whitman, and then Rilke, and I'm sure there are others. But so two questions: sort of talk about, or
Sure.
read some of the interior landscape, and then reflect about how, uh, why these and when these quotes come into the poem, and the purpose they serve when they do.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah, sounds good. Okay. So let me start with interior landscape. Fallen horse, 1. Snow falls on the fallen horse, belly down in a field. Flakes fatten, arrowed for breathing heat, more likely freeze. Faces in profile urge the body onward to the blue railroad's rulered path, or away from broken slogans. Always the ambiguities. Black flecks dot the white as if the horse could rise up in pieces, as if it could live as constellations do. And then I'll read the next that comes up several pages later. Interior landscape, fallen horse, 2.
okay.
The black horse flares blue, ears lowered. It must be fear or abandon. Flames intimate, tree bark lowered over itself. Each trunk a single painterly stroke, up close the paper of its life. When this piece breaks, will this piece ever break away? White horse behind the curtain, oblivious. Arrows whistled, flank pistoled into night.
That's just a really strong line. Flank pistoled into night. The use of the
Yeah.
word pistol like that
Oh, nice.
as a verb. I don't think, I think it's the first time in the language that it's been used as a verb, but I may be wrong, but well done. Congratulations. And then, will this peace ever break away? That's one of those fundamental questions, right? I mean, just like,
Yes.
you know, how is it, how did you put it about love earlier? What is it what makes us loved?
Right.
I think I
Yeah.
can reread this book and looking for the basic questions that I can then take away and contemplate,
Yeah.
Um,
As far as quotes, you mentioned some
right,
quotes
right,
in the
right.
book. And lately I've been thinking about there was I've been thinking about writers who have meant a lot to me and what they have in common. And there was advice that Stanley Kunitz apparently gave to Mark Doty, which was to cleave to the legendary. And I I love that as a guide for writing because I love the idea of the poem being able to convey a depth of human experience.
Mm.
And I feel like that I think subconsciously when I've pulled in quotes that speak to me, I mean, I think that's part of the impulse is to pull in that voice from the past or the story that goes with the myth or whatever it might be and introduce it into the poem.
Yes, and how did you put it? Cleaving to the legendary. You know,
Yeah, isn't that great? I love that.
yeah, you're also a carrier of the flame and the water and the language and the tradition each
Yeah.
time you write a poem, I think. I mean, so it seems natural that these lines will come into your work because you're not only writing, I suggest for me or for other readers in our time, but you're writing for these other poets and others who have gone before us. And I know it's not logical to talk about writing with people who have already passed on, but there's a kind of a super hyper logic that, I mean, you are engaging and teaching as well at the same time, because any reader, any student of poetry reads the line, or reads the reference to Whitman, for example, and then could turn to Leaves of Grass, or turn to the particular poem where that line comes from. So I think it's a useful service you do as a poet. But
I love that in your work too, under the largeness of the voice, you know.
Yeah. Thank you. I just think we are teachers, and sort of we express our art and we teach our art. It's all part of the same process, and we are. My father once wrote a poem to my mother where he said, I am made of the food, I'm composed of the food you fed me. This beautiful line.
Yes.
And that, so we are made up of what we've eaten, what we've read, and we present it again in new ways with our own colors. We pistol it out into the world.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there are figures that are common in the Catholic, or let's say the Christian tradition. I mean, Lazarus, for example, shows up, and then you have the Song of Songs, and tell me about how does one write a? I mean, then you have writers like Chesterton and Thomas Merton and others who are Catholics writing poems or stories. So how does John Paul II was a poet and a pope? Is there I'm just maybe there's nothing to this question, I don't know, but is there a religious impulse in you when you write a poem, or in some of these poems, that's also guiding your hand as you write? I don't mean necessarily that literally, but maybe the hand is being guided by. Tell me if there is, and if there isn't, or reflect it.
Perhaps not in a literal sense, but I think it's such a part of the fabric of who I am. And I love those stories. I really love those stories. I love the humanness in those stories. And I like finding the figures who are maybe a little downtrodden, or maybe, that aren't the hero of the story. And I like feeling, one thing being raised Catholic is that, feeling that history, that connection to that history. It means a lot to me, and it still is, it clearly comes out in my writing.
And all power to it, because it is your truth. It is truth. Tell me about Pentecost and Lazarus. I don't know if you want to read either of them, but these are in line with this conversation about religion and Catholicism. And Pentecost, if you see, I'm one of the. I always get confused. I mean, Larkin wrote the Whitsun weddings. In England, they call it Whitsun, I think. Pentecost here.
Oh, okay.
And I think Pentecost refers to the time before Easter, between. Am I confusing myself here?
Well, now I'm diving back into my religion classes, but Pentecost, I think, is when the Holy Spirit descends down after Easter.
Oh, after Easter. Okay, that makes
more sense. Right.
Yeah.
I think after Jesus ascended.
Right.
Is the Pentecost.
Exactly right.
And that poem, I mean, that Pentecost poem, I went to, this was a long time ago. There was an exhibit at the Guggenheim of Brazilian art, and there was these wooden figures. I think they were meant to be the 12 apostles that were paraded through the streets.
Okay.
And it's an imagining of that, and it kind of turns to the mother in the street who's kneeling down into the gravel, and where is she represented in that parade, in that moment. So that's kind of a direction I go sometimes too, wondering, those absences in those stories.
Right. In this case, the mother's children. Why don't you read that poem? It's on page
Oh,
22.
sure.
Yeah, Pentecost, because it also speaks to what you were saying earlier about how the left out, the downtrodden, the dispossessed, which is also in the Catholic sort of teaching, isn't it? That Jesus was not a disciple for a prophet for the well-to-do, but rather for the people who've been ignored, and everybody has a right to their place in the kingdom of heaven. Pentecost, 18th century Brazil. That's the epigraph. Yeah.
Okay, Pentecost, 18th century Brazil. I can't remember the details. Saints carved and paraded, half rapture, half hollow. Priests weaving streets. I didn't see up close the patterns, brushstrokes, breeze through their clothes. I only saw the display centuries later, strategic light, statues spaced. I picture mothers and children knee down in gravel. Who craned to see them? So I return in the poem, find the sculptor's gouge, a smooth hardwood cheek, scar ascending like doves.
Yeah, magnificent. And again, you invent a verb for all time. Who craned to see them? Well, to crane. It may exist, but it exists for the first time for me. And thank you. And I think of the crane, the bird, and the craning in that action. Beautiful. Find the sculptor's gouge, a smooth heartwood cheek, a scar ascending like doves. Scar ascending like doves. I mean, it's the pathos, right? You're talking the pain, the suffering, which is part of living, and so you're not giving us sort of technicolor happiness or something in your work. You're just trying to describe what is, and then there's the saving grace that keeps us going.
Yeah, right. I do like poets that have that kind of unflinching quality to their voice. I remember when I first read Carl Phillips, I felt that way. Louise Glick. I'm really drawn to that.
And in the poem Lazarus, I thought that is an interesting twist on Lazarus, right? Or maybe I was not getting it all, but from the moment her body freight train from mine, I was a Lazarus. Tell me about the beginning of that poem, Freight Train from Mine. Interesting.
Yeah. So, the story of Lazarus, of course, is that he dies and he's buried and then he's brought back to life.
Right.
And I think there was something in having a child that, in the case of this poem, brings the speaker back to a different level of living.
Right.
A different way of being alive in the world that before wasn't there. So I was kind of playing around with
wonderful. Yeah.
the story in that way.
Thank you. Would you care to read that one? I mean, it's
sure. Yeah. Lazarus. From the moment her body freight trained from mine, I was her Lazarus. Breath given against my shoulder, body its own belief. Her need spilled like water, and my hands there to catch it, trumping my pillbox of loss. Now late afternoon, iced over yard, still spongy in parts, she howls from the center. 2 years on this earth, wielding herself like a sword. Stone that seals, stone that rolls away, world on its platter, coming around and around.
Yeah. So Lazarus is revived. The baby is born, and the baby, that process. Sorry, I'm just off my. The baby revives the mother, and then is what happens? What happens next? Can one keep that moment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think what happens is that little human is taking on their own, coming into their own self,
Right,
um,
right.
very powerfully. I mean, children are, I see a lot of power in children. And as you know, especially when they don't have any inhibitions yet and they speak their minds and they speak to what they want. And so I think it also became a meditation on that. That way of being alive is so unique to kids,
Right,
and
right, right.
yeah, a whole other energy.
There's a lot to learn about very basic things in this book. We're just talking about a child growing up and how a child is at 2 and 3, and I'm thinking of to my own children and how much I've forgotten.
Yeah, when
So
they're
that
that age. Yes.
um, one can just keep reading and reading. Every poem is beautiful. In this book, I'm very grateful that I've had this chance to spend time with it and to talk with you about it. Are there some poems that you'd particularly like to share before we sort of not close this conversation, but let's say end this particular conversation with the idea of having more in the future as new poems are written, new babies are
Sure.
born.
Sure. I think, I'll read, what as you said, there can be some darkness in this book, but I think ultimately it's a hopeful book. Um, it's a book that's looking to, it's kind of a meditation on believing in relationships and believing in the connections we have with each other.
Believing in relationship. Yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah. And so I'll read this poem, which I think speaks to that. Rise. In the dream, her heart was a fist of dough, the secret in its beating. Rise, rise. With each expansion, rivers erupted, dusty skin. Her geography shifted. In the dream, her seaside neighbors noticed a change. Some guessed an affair, others a child. The older ones touched their faces, but everyone felt a longing they had long forgotten. She longed for the drama of birth, her head engaged in the pelvic floor. She would move slowly this time, memorize the muscled walls, how they held her as she was pushed away. In the dream, she climbed a mountain path and witnessed sun, then shadow, dusk. Her heart went on its work, losing the scent of just created. She missed herself suddenly, yeast and yolk. Air rushed from her mouth. The fist retracted. Her seaside neighbors noticed a change. Each rose to their longing, and the longing reduced to a smaller space.
Mm. I think of that line in Blake, we are on earth a little space to learn to bear the beams of love. And this black
Mm.
body and this sunburned face is but a cloud and like a shady grove. It's a poem. It's actually a religious poem in a sense. I mean, it's about, and he wrote during the anti-slavery movement in England at the time. And anyway, he talks about it's called The Little Black Boy. And then there's a sort of vision of a little black boy and a little white boy shading each other and helping each other and around the tent of God like lambs, remembering another line of Blake from Songs of Innocence and Experience. But anyway, this is a beautiful, beautiful poem. Thank you. I I would like to ask you also, I mean, we're towards the end of the book. There are two poems to finish the book, But We're Not Trees and Glass Church. And I wonder if, because there's a question or there's a statement in But We Are Not Trees that I think I think it's a very profound poem, and perhaps you wouldn't mind sharing that, and we could perhaps come to a temporary stop in terms of our conversations about poetry with that.
Yeah,
That
that
sounds
sounds
good.
great.
All right.
Yeah. But we are not trees after Campbell McGrath. Through the window, South Mountain glows copper. Stockpot filled, 3/4, I toss in salt with a biblical air. Every evening, this moment of blinding. Every evening, someone about to come. A squirrel alone stutters the fence. I never noticed how expressive the tail, how removed from its compact heart. I'm tipping myself toward water in sudden commitment, squirrel hurdling space. When I was younger, I thought that was us, the thrashing branch. But we are not trees. We require an act of will.
I don't have my proverbial hat on, but I would take it off to
Thank you.
you for this poem.
Thank you. Thank you so
You
much.
have, it's just, and it's one of many outstanding in the book. But we are not trees, we require an active will. Yeah,
And that's from Campbell McGrath. That is the line, not verbatim, but from his poem, A Letter to James Wright.
I see. Okay.
Yes, I
Anyway,
can't take credit for that one.
no, but that's all right. That's how you finish it. I wanted to just contemplate that line. I don't know the Campbell McGrath poem, so thank you. I will lead now to look for Campbell McGrath's poem that you mentioned about James Wright. Good. But when I was younger, I thought that was us, the threshing branch. We're not, we're not trees. Um, Mary, tell me where you are with poetry. With your, are you working on a new book? Do you have a new set of poems? Tell us about that.
I do. I worked on, like many people, I worked on poems a lot during the pandemic and the lockdown. And I have a second manuscript. It speaks to, it definitely speaks to this desire for human connections, but it pulls in this element of place. So the places we live, places we travel, places we come from. Um, and while I was in the pandemic, I also came across this book by Gaston Bachelard, The Poetics of Space. Have you read that book?
I've not I've come across it actually. I don't. I may even have it somewhere, but yeah. I have
I'm
not read
trying to read, so I'm trying to read it, but I don't get so much of it. I don't have a philosophy background, but it examines the poetic imagination using the house as a tool for analysis. So I've kind of been reading that and trying to read it with a friend and make sense of it in combination with these poems. So it's kind of a fun project to have an additional uh, something else to kind of bounce against as I'm working on the collection and putting it together. So that's the latest.
Great. The Poetics of Space, right?
The
Yeah.
Poetics of Space,
Yeah,
yeah.
no. I've actually held that book in my hands, but I can't remember what happened to it. But I admit I struggled with reading some of it and then probably put it aside or gave it back to the.
Yeah.
But I will come back to it. I'll look for it because it's certainly one of those books that's sort of theoretical books about what we do are useful for us to read or to at least to sort of bounce our images against, and see
Yes, right.
do
And
they
it uses poetic imagery throughout. And
right.
there's this line that the poetic image is like a sudden salience on the surface of the psyche.
Mm,
And I think that's what pulled me into the book because I feel like, yes, I completely agree. It kind of speaks to the idea of your head being, coming clear, chopped clear off, like Emily Dickinson. So yeah, I enjoy that.
very
It
good.
pushes me. It's challenging for me.
Yeah, no, and we
I guess
yeah,
that's good.
that is good, very good. I'm looking forward to reading those poems and wish you all the best with the finishing up that manuscript or getting it placed and all that, uh, and then going on because you are you have the gift, the lyric gift, and that is something you can always rest on because it's in your lines, the way you write, and I'm grateful to. I'm a big champion of lyric poets and poets who have the song in their lines. So then you just
I'm
have
so
to
grateful
just write.
for you and for you're one of those writers that just creates community that's so generous. So grateful for that and
It's
for this chance to talk to you.
actually, you mentioned the pandemic. This initiative about the YouTube and the Poetry Channel is also an initiative of the pandemic. I started
Mm,
doing this early in the pandemic, and now there are something like 800 videos of different. Uh, but
like,
but but the conversation poets are just half a dozen or a dozen or something. So that
yeah,
will grow. And so anyway, hopefully in the library that is YouTube, people can access it whenever they Google your name and my name or just your name and YouTube or something. We'll see once it's up there. And
yeah,
I wish you good luck with um, selling this book. I mean, after all, Walt Whitman sold his books, and we should sell our books as well.
yes.
I
Thank
hope
you.
people will. I hope this conversation was fun and that you can share it also. Thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
I'm going to thank you. I'm going to stop the the recording now.